Welcome everyone to this press conference, which concludes the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial. We have with us today the COP27 President and Foreign Minister of Egypt, Mr. Sami Shukri, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Mr. Simon Steele, and the Danish Minister for Development Cooperation and Global Climate Policy, Mr. Dan Jørgensen. Simon Steele unfortunately has to catch an early flight and might have to leave a bit early, and he will be giving the first statement. Mr. Steele, I turn the floor to you.
Well, thank you and welcome to all of you, and apologies for my remarks and run move. But these last 2 days have been very important, and the timing of this ministerial is extremely fortuitous, with yesterday's release by the IPCC of their latest report, which outlines in very stark terms where we are and probably more significantly where we are not. So the importance of the convening of a selection, a broad selection of ministerial representatives across parties that make up the negotiating bloc within the UNFCCC is so important. And this, since COP27, this is the first convening of ministers, following up, building on the discussions, the outputs of COP27, and really setting the tone for the negotiations, the climate discussion, climate engagement, as we now move down the path to COP28 in the Emirates. And the preparatory work for these negotiations every year become more and more complex. And more engaged. Again, speaking to the importance of this this gathering. And in COP28, significant deliverables on all of the negotiating tracks. And the discussions, the breakout sessions over these past couple of days touched on all of these. So whether it is on the area of mitigation and the needing to close the ambition gap and the emissions gap there, the call for greater efforts across the board was clearly heard. Whether on adaptation, the need for greater support on the adaptation agenda, and as we know, the less that we mitigate is the more that countries, especially those that are most vulnerable and exposed to climate impacts, have to do on the adaptation side, and the need for greater means of implementation in supporting that agenda. And of course, the area of finance, we know that we're not where we need to be in terms of mobilizing the $100 billion, and the need this year to resolve that with a very clear political demonstration, or the need for a clear political demonstration as early as possible this year as to how that financing gap will be closed. And again, on the finance side, responding to the calls from both Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh on the reform and the need for the multilateral development banks, international financial institutions to evolve, to respond more effectively to the climate challenge. Loss and damage. This year, an important year in the operationalization of the fund and funding arrangements in addressing loss and damage, and parties' views on the road ahead there. And then the overarching piece with the global stocktake, that is the key deliverable for COP28. That reflection on that backward look in terms of where we are, again, where we're not, but again, a consensus across the board that we already know where we are, and the need to focus on the forward-looking piece and how the global community responds to that stock take, and calls for a roadmap to chart the path forward for the course correction that is needed so that that global effort is 1.5 aligned, Paris aligned. So it just leaves me to say that an important year, and every COP is important, but there is special significance to all that needs to be delivered in this coming period. And for me to thank our gracious hosts, and to Dan and the incoming and current presidency in organizing this important milestone meeting on the road to COP28. So thank you.
The next speaker will be the COP president and foreign minister of Egypt, Mr. Shukri. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. The IPCC synthesis report, as my good friend Simon has just highlighted, which was released yesterday, is yet another sobering testament about the magnitude and gravity of the climate crisis. IPCC told us what we already know. However, it further detailed the situation at every region and every sector. We are clearly off track. The 1.5 degrees might slip away. The adaptation window is closing rapidly. Losses and damage are becoming a hallmark of our present reality. I quote the UN Secretary General when he said, "Climate action is needed at all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once." This is the only viable opportunity before humankind to reverse the grinding trend and survive this existential threat. Against this backdrop, close to 50 climate ministers and envoys met here for the second time at the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial. Our convening was the first since COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and it is also the first high-level meeting on the road to COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. I was pleased to co-chair this ministerial consultations for the second time, and I am very appreciative of the leadership, hospitality, and support provided by Minister Jorgensen and the Danish government. My presence here side by side with COP28 President-designate during the meetings is an unequivocal signal to unity of purpose and a continued commitment. COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh and its Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan stands for the shift towards a new era of urgently needed solutions and implementation. The general spirit in Sharm was less talk, less empty promises, and more concrete deliverables on the ground at scale and speed. It was a sound call for a grand bargain for climate supported by a solid partnership between nations, private sector, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders. Several key and historic breakthroughs were obtained in Sharm el-Sheikh in a victory for multilateralism and international cooperation. At COP27, parties established the new funding arrangements and a fund to respond to loss and damage, adopted a new work program on mitigation, maintained the call for a new and updated NDCs to keep the 1.5 degree within reach. It reaffirmed the imperative of the concept of just transition through a first ever work program, agreed on a framework on the road to a credible outcome on the global goal on adaptation, called for honoring the long overdue symbolic $100 billion commitment while reforming the IFIs and MDBs with a view of ensuring that climate finance is appropriate, sufficient, accessible, and concessional for developing countries. As COP President, I continue to diligently follow up on this work and urge parties to work together. This weekend, the Egyptian city of Luxor will be hosting the first meeting of the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage. Whilst my satisfaction with these major outcomes of Sharm el-Sheikh, notwithstanding a moment of great difficulty for the international community as a whole and a thread of overlapping crises and cascading risks, I am firmly convinced that much more needs to be done, and thus a heavy lifting on the road to COP28 in the UAE and beyond. We need to operationalize Sharm el-Sheikh's outcomes and demonstrate more ambitious action. Our action should be measured by responding to best available science while honoring the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities under the Convention and its Paris agreements. I'd like to thank my colleague and good friend, Dan, for the hospitality and generosity and his excellent leadership in conducting these ministerials. I think they have had an impact. I benefited from them last year in preparations of my presidency, and I'm sure that they set the tone for greater cooperation, greater understanding, and a common will to address the very challenging climate crisis that we face. Thank you.
And now for the final statement by Danish Minister for Development, Cooperation and Global Climate Policy, Mr. Dan Jørgensen.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for those kind words, and thank you so much for your leadership. Not only was Sharm el-Sheikh instrumental in making decisions that we've waited for a very long time and that are now there to be implemented, you've also pointed for a way forward from there, so thank you so much for that. I am, of course, very honored to have been able to host the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial and to have welcomed prominent climate ministers and key decision makers to Copenhagen again this year. Together with colleagues from more than 40 countries, we have over the last 2 days reaffirmed our commitment to follow up on the COP27 decisions and drive progress towards COP28 in Dubai later this year. COP28 will, in my opinion, be the most important COP since Paris. The IPCC and the UN Secretary General warned us yesterday that the climate crisis is on the brink of spinning out of control. Time is running out and action is needed. It is a promising sign from the ministerial here in Copenhagen that no participants disputed the need to reduce emissions by 43% by 2030 in order to keep the 1 target degree alive. The discussions at the Copenhagen Climate Ministerial have highlighted several areas of particular concern in order to reach a successful COP28. I would in particular like to highlight the need to reach agreement on the following. First, we need to deliver on our promise to get on track of 1.5 degrees. To this end, more ambitious NDCs are needed, and we simply need to agree on a commitment to phase out unabated fossil fuels. This should be replaced, among other things, by approximately 1,000 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity every year. Second, the climate crisis is a fact. This also entails that more attention needs to be cast on the need for increasing adaptation action, including access to adaptation finance for the most vulnerable countries. Third, we need to operationalize the new funding arrangements responding to loss and damage caused by climate change. We need to find funding solutions, and we need to do it fast. Fourth and last, the global mobilization of climate finance, we need to mobilize financing on a scale to enable the green transformation, not least in Africa. And the developed countries should of course deliver on mobilizing the $100 billion that has been agreed upon. In our view, these vital issues should be a part of the global stocktake, which will be concluded at COP28. The global stocktake should both ensure that the countries have a shared understanding of the status of the Paris Agreement and, even more importantly, inform parties in enhancing action and international cooperation across the board. With those words, thank you very much.
And now we open the floor to questions. We have about 10 minutes.
Olaf Christensen, Danish TV2. Mr. COP President, you said that the 1.5 target is in danger of slipping away. And you, Mr. Jorgensen, you mentioned that nobody among the ministers have disputed the need to keep the 1.5. But have any of you at this meeting heard any country commit itself to reducing its emissions so that we can actually get on the path to what you're talking about, a sustainable development?
Well, undoubtedly, maybe participants didn't particularly divulge what they are undertaking in maintaining the 1.5 degree, and necessarily that would entail reduction of emissions. But certainly they all spoke about the importance of maintaining 1.5, and thereby subsequently the only way to do that is through the reduction of emissions in terms of revising and enhancing their NDCs, and effectively not only doing that in terms of their national programs, but also providing the finance and facilities that would enable others who are less capable of providing those resources so as to undertake their common but differentiated responsibilities. So I think there was a consensus on the need to take immediate and impactful action to maintain the 1.5, and we expect that that will be translated into effective measures, policies, and legislation.
And maybe I can add to that quite a few European countries argued that the EU needs to increase the ambitions in our common NDC. Right now it states that we will reduce our emissions by at least 55%. But actually, if we look at the legislation that's been negotiated within the last year, we have results that would indicate that we can go further than that and have a higher reduction target than that. In Denmark, of course, we've also decided recently that we will increase our ambitions so that we will move forward the target on becoming carbon neutral to 2045. And in 2050, we will be a carbon negative country, meaning that we have to reduce our emissions by 110%.
Hi, Louise Rasmussen from Reuters. Is there any consensus coming together on what shape the reformation of the climate financing system should take?
Again, this is an area that was highlighted during various interventions. I can't say that during these meetings there was a particular formulation of what that constitutes. And of course, this also depends on the institutions themselves and the parties that contribute to those institutions and the degree of their willingness to undertake the necessary reform. But it is a growing request by a very large proportion of the parties and participants, and I believe it should be addressed within the context of those institutions and their governing bodies.
I can add to that I also heard many parties argue today and yesterday that they feel there's a window of opportunity right now with regards to reform of the MDBs, especially, of course, the World Bank, and that we need a greening of the bank, meaning that the aim of the bank should no longer be focused only on poverty reduction, even though the elimination of poverty is still a main focus, obviously, for the World Bank. It should also be the case that in the future the bank will look much more on fighting climate change and on climate adaptation issues. Also, we had many discussions on innovative sources of finance. So whereas the MDBs is a discussion that's relevant here, but where decisions will be made elsewhere, maybe in the future we can have decisions in the COP process on innovative sources of finance. My own country has put forward a proposal, at least for discussion, that maybe you could put a levy on bunker fuels in the shipping sector. Other countries have also supported that. I also heard parties saying a taxation levy on fossil fuels, taxation on plane tickets, things like that. In any case, I think it is important to realize that right now we're discussing how to mobilize $100 billion, and that has not been possible. Frankly speaking, that is actually an embarrassment, since we know that 100 billion won't even cut it. We need trillions.
And now I will be reading a question on behalf of Frank Jordans from the AP. In response to the latest IPCC report, the UN Secretary General called for an acceleration agenda where the developed countries would commit to reaching net zero as close as possible to 2040, while emerging economies would commit to reaching net zero as close as possible to 2050. Which of these countries meeting in Copenhagen support those targets? And if not, why not?
Should we answer for all 45 countries? Probably a little bit difficult. Do you want to?
Well, again, I can't say that there was a specific answer to the aspirational goals that the Secretary General has conveyed. They reflect the magnitude of the crisis, the importance of parties fulfilling the ambitions and elevating their ambitions necessarily to meet the challenge of climate change and to be impactful. These goals will be, I'm sure, addressed within the national context and within the national abilities. And thereby, I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone, but I can speak on behalf of Egypt, that we are doing everything possible in terms of our energy mix and have elevated our ambitions so that by 2035 we might be able to achieve 42 or 43% in renewable energies. I think that is an accomplishment that has been achieved within a very short time frame. And we anticipate that we might overshoot that ambition because of the technology that is developing. But here we rely on the transfer of technology from our friends and partners, among them Denmark and others, who would be willing to transfer that technology readily and provide us the opportunity to even extend further our ambition. So again, this is an ongoing process, one where we can only incentivize and encourage everyone to do their role.